Hello everyone, back tuning into today's first video, doing the 7th Autumn 2019 Analogues update for today's first video. So, going to be quite a big update in terms of the Autumn Analogues today, because we're looking at ENSO. So, we're looking at El Nino, La Nina, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Before I get on with that, though, just to say that coming up later on today, we're going to have GWV's Sunday Roundup. So, it will be your usual Sunday afternoon eclectic mix of this and that, and that'll be coming up at GWV's sometime just after lunchtime. Big thank you to our Analogues guru, James, for getting the charts together for us. Big thank you to James for doing that for us this week. So it's going to be quite a long video. If you can't watch it all in one go, then you can come back to the website and watch it whenever you want on demand from this evening, because I'm going to place it on the autumn updates and forecast page, and there will be a written summary that goes with it as well. And I'll get that onto the autumn updates page around 7 or 8 o'clock this evening. As I say, it can be quite a long video, so sit back, relax, enjoy it, get yourself a cup of tea, a cup of chair, and a few biscuits, and we shall get on with the 7th Autumn 2019 Analogues update. So, as I say, we're looking at ENSO for this update. Now, what we're going to look at is autumns that are going from El Nino to either ENSO neutral or possibly to La Nina. So, this is depicting the CFS-V2 forecast for the central part of the equatorial Pacific Ocean. The black line shows where we've been with ENSO, and then the black dash line and the coloured lines at the end where the CFS ensembles are forecasting ENSO to go. So we've got the temperature anomalies on the side. You can see that through the end of last year, 2018, and into the early part of 2019, we had a weak El Nino going on. We was just here, sort of around half to 1 degree above average. Since then, we've gone back to ENSO neutral, basically, through the course of July. We're back to ENSO neutral. And the forecast part of this is showing that we're either going to stay at ENSO neutral, so we're going to go from El Nino to neutral, ENSO neutral, which would be around there, ENSO neutral on the cool side, I suppose, or possibly from El Nino, again, just there, to La Nina, which is just there. The CFS-V2 ensemble mean, which is the black dash line, that is getting into, just about into La Nina territory through sort of October, November, December, that kind of period, up to January. So this autumn will either be Nino to neutral, or it will be Nino to Nina, El Nino to La Nina. Now, I would suspect that what will happen is that, because these models always have to be dragged kicking and screaming to a La Nina, so I would suspect that in the end we will go into a weak La Nina during this autumn. That's my suspicion, I guess. But of course we can't totally discount the chance that we will stay at ENSO neutral. So we've got to look at both sets of data, El Nino to ENSO neutral and El Nino to La Nina. They could both be relevant for this autumn. Hopefully by the time we can do the forecast on the 31st of August, the last day of August, when we do the autumn forecast, hopefully by then we will know which batch is the right batch to go with, either Nino to neutral or Nino to Nina. But at the moment, we've got to look at both sets of analogues to see what the impacts of either El Nino to neutral or El Nino to La Nina could be on our autumn weather. So the first batch of analogues that we're going to start with is going to be El Nino to ENSO neutral autumn. So all of these autumns in this first half of the video have done the transition from El Nino earlier in the year to La Nina, to ENSO neutral, I should say, by the autumn. The one thing we haven't had time to do is take out the very strong El Nino events. this El Nino that we've had, the El Nino that we had at the start of the year, was a very weak El Nino event. So ideally, we would only be dealing with weak El Ninos to ENSO neutral and weak El Ninos to La Nina. Haven't had time to isolate those out, so we have got most of the El Nino events going back into the 1800s here, be they weak, moderate, or strong. So the first autumn we're looking at is the autumn of 1866. So this autumn went from El Nino to ENSO neutral. And the autumn of 1866 was quite unsettled, actually, with below average heights coming in off the Atlantic, along with the jet stream too. Looks as though it would be relatively mild. It's a rather westerly autumn. The jet stream's coming through like that. There's only a very weak northern blocking signal, so a relatively mild but unsettled autumn to start us off in 1866. The next autumn is the autumn of 1878. Again, this one going from El Nino to ENSO neutral. And we have a blocking signal here, a large area of above average heights over the Arctic extending down into Greenland, with below average heights, a trough of low pressure across the UK and the west of Europe. Now, this is getting set up, of course, for what was a very cold, severely cold winter, for the winter of 1878, 1879. I think we already begin to see the first signs of that pattern getting going through the autumn of 1878, which would be a rather cold and unsettled autumn, beginning to get that pattern going, that blocking pattern going for the winter of 1878, 1879. Next autumn is 1881. This one has below average heights out to the west of us and a Scandinavian high sitting up to the north. That'll be bringing in east winds. Probably a lot of dry weather through this autumn. Remember, autumn's a transitional season, so if you've got high pressure in this sort of position in September, it's probably going to be relatively mild. But if you've got that high pressure, if you've got high pressure in that sort of position in November, it's going to be a lot colder. So I would suspect in the end probably quite a cold but relatively dry autumn in 1881. 1897 is the next autumn where we've gone from El Nino to ENSO neutral. This one's anticyclonic with a big area of high pressure sitting almost over the top of the country. A dry and relatively mild, maybe even quite warm autumn there for 1897. 1900 is the next autumn that's going from El Nino to ENSO neutral through the year, arriving at ENSO neutral by the autumn. This one with below average heights up to our north, above average heights to our south. The jet stream will be coming through rather like that. So we would expect a relative amount of dry and quiet weather there, probably a little bit more unsettled than 1897. And a relatively mild autumn as well, I would have thought, in 1900. We've got 1906 turning up next. This one, again, hinting at above average heights around Scandinavia. Winds coming in from the east. I think so far we have tended to favour slightly anticyclonic conditions so far, but very early in this analogues package. That autumn, 1906, had an incredible heat wave at the beginning of September when 35 degrees was recorded widely across the UK on the first day of September 1906. Really, really incredible heat wave. 1912 is our next autumn that's gone from El Nino to ENSO neutral by the autumn, and this one has above average heights to our west, below average heights to the east, and so a relatively cool and possibly quite unsettled autumn there in the autumn of 1912. 1915 looks like this. It's got above average heights blocking over the Arctic, a strong blocking signal with below average heights underneath it. This one has a very, very cold November. I'm not sure if November 1915 is the coldest on record. I'm sure someone will let me know in the comments, but I know that November 1915 is or was a very, very cold month. Then we've got the autumn of 1919 that's going from El Nino to ENSO neutral. This one above average heights out to our west, below average heights to the east. This is a cold and unsettled autumn in 1919. September is particularly interesting because it's very warm in the first half of September and then goes very cold for September in the second half. And in fact, I believe there was some snow across the northern parts of the country late in September, I should say. 1919. 1926 is our next El Nino to ENSO neutral autumn. This one looks very unsettled with low pressure, but average heights right over top of the UK. Probably quite a mild autumn, that one, but I would have thought pretty wet. 1931 is our next autumn. This one looks like we're going back to anticyclonic conditions, above average heights centred over top of the country, so a relatively dry and pretty mild or warm autumn. 1931. We've got 1966 turning up next. So a long gap then in terms of El Nino to ENSO neutral autumns. A long gap from 1931 to 1966. The autumn of 1966 is very unsettled, with below average heights through not just the UK but much of Northern Europe, above average heights pulled out into the Atlantic. So it's pretty cool, but the main thing about this autumn is that it's very unsettled, very wet, and I think I said before in these Analogues updates, it includes the Aberfan disaster in Wales, where there was a landslip caused because of the copious amounts of rain that fell into that part of Wales during October 1966, and it caused a mudslide to go down onto a school. Unfortunately, it did kill some children. So it was a very wet autumn in 1966. 1978 is the complete opposite. This again going from El Nino to ENSO neutral. This was a weak El Nino as well during the winter of 1977. 1978. So this one, it has below average heights up to the north. The jet stream is pushed northward as well. It's a strongly zonal signal, but the jet stream is pushed north. We've got the above average heights centred almost over the top of the country. Just a very dry, very mild, in fact quite warm autumn. Absolutely no sign whatsoever of the cold winter that was to await for the winter of 78, 79, the famous winter of discontent, very cold and snowy winter. No sign of that through the autumn of 1978 until the last week of November, when suddenly this high pressure would have been ridging in from the Azores. It collapsed and it allowed the first attack of northerly winds through the final week of November 1978. But otherwise it was a very dry and really mild autumn. Then we go through to 1992, the next time we went from El Nino to ENSO neutral through the autumn. This one rather an unsettled autumn with below average heights across much of Northern Europe. Thing with this is that it has a pretty unsettled September. October is quite cold in 1992, and then November is a pretty nondescript sort of month. 2003 is our next autumn. That's going from El Nino to ENSO neutral. Again, that was quite a weak El Nino through the winter of 2002-2003. So this one, we have the above average heights across many parts of the northern hemisphere, you would say, but particularly around the North Atlantic and into much of Northern Europe. So it's a pretty dry autumn in 2003. September, October are both very dry months. It's a pretty warm September as well. That long hot summer carried on into September, and then October, again, anticyclonic month, but it went a lot colder in October 2003. 2005 is our next autumn, and potentially for this Analogues package, I think it's the last one. Yes, it is. So the final autumn that goes from El Nino to ENSO neutral. And that tells us actually 2005, so some time ago, we're probably about due actually to have a Nino to neutral autumn. So keep that at the back of your mind. But the final autumn is 2005, with above average heights over and to the east and northeast of the country. This one, very warm September, very warm October, warm to the first half of November, and then much colder in the second half of November, with a real northerly snap in the second half of November 2005. But otherwise, it's actually a very warm autumn and I think quite a wet autumn as well. So putting all of that together, this is how all of these Septembers combined are looking when we're going from El Nino to ENSO neutral through the autumn. So these are ENSO neutral autumns, but they're coming off the back of El Ninos before. And for September, all Septembers combined, they tend to have an anticyclonic signal. The high pressure tends to be centred a little bit to our west. However, I think there's enough there to say that basically a lot of these Septembers have a big ridge of above average heights, a big area of high pressure around the UK, let's say, and low pressure up to the north and out to west. Jet streams push northwards rather like that. So these are relatively warm and dry Septembers. On average, there will be years that deviate, obviously, but overall they tend to be relatively warm and dry Septembers. For the Octobers, this is how they look when we have El Nino to ENSO neutral. So for the Octobers, again, we tend to have above average heights to our north, with below average heights to the south. So again, quite an anticyclonic signal. This time over high pressure just a little bit further northwest, and possibly allow some slightly cooler or colder air to come in from the north or from the northeast. Then a big change for November. So the Novembers combined looks like that, and they're much more unsettled, aren't they, with a deep trough of low pressure through the UK and through most of Western Europe as well. There's probably a bit of a dip in the jet stream with 500 millibar flow, but there's no real northern blocky signal, so I don't think they're particularly cold Novembers on average. I suspect actually they're quite mild Novembers probably, but very, very wet Novembers, I'm sure. On average, there will be years that deviate, of course. And then finally, this is how all of the autumns combined are looking when we are coming from El Nino to ENSO neutral. And, well, above average heights tends to be to our west. Below average heights tends to be to our east. But do keep in mind that that's skewed a lot, I think, that all autumns combined by what's happening in November. September and October are relatively anticyclonic months, particularly the Septembers. By the time you get through to November, though, it flips completely and goes to favour much, much wetter conditions. And so I suspect that all autumns combined chart is kind of like combining the dry signal for these for the Septembers in particular, but also for the Octobers to some degree as well, combining that with the very wet signal that we have, low pressure dominated signal that we have for the Novembers. Overall, these look like relatively mild autumns, I think, when we're coming out of El Nino to ENSO neutral. Strong anticyclonic signal to start off with, much wetter later on. Right, we're going to pause the video there. I want to move that from stop to pause, don't I? Don't want to lose recording. We're going to pause the video there. I'm going to go and get a drink of water, and I'll meet back here in around 2 seconds' time, and we will then go through the El Nino to La Nina autumns, and we'll see how they compare to the Nino to neutral autumn. So it's going to be quite interesting to see how that works out. I'll see you in around 2 seconds' time. Okay, we're back, and we are ready to resume the 7th Autumn 2019 Analogues update from GWV. So, in the first part of the video, before we have a little break, we talked about autumns that were coming out of El Ninos and going to ENSO neutral. So they were Nino to neutral autumns. That is one possibility for the autumn of 2019, that we are out of El Nino now. We're back to ENSO neutral, I believe. So the one possibility is that we will stay at ENSO neutral for this autumn. The other possibility, and the one that I'm favouring a little bit more actually, is the chance that we go from El Nino to La Nina. So we go from a warm event to a cold event. We're already beginning to see signs of a cold event starting to develop in the eastern part of the equatorial Pacific Ocean. I suspect that will begin to snowball over the next few weeks and the next couple of months. So my hunch is that this is going to be an El Nino to La Nina autumn. In which case, that's the next batch of analogues that we are going to look at. So the next batch of analogues will be El Nino to La Nina autumn. So these are autumns that have La Nina developing, essentially. They are La Nina ascending autumns off the back of an El Nino. The first autumn is 1869. That is a La Nina autumn following an El Nino. So this one with below average heights to the east, a trough of low pressure in over Scandinavia and much of northern Europe, above average heights out to west. In fact, it's a blocking signal, mid-Atlantic ridge going up towards Greenland type signal. Jet stream going something like that. This looks like quite a cold and unsettled autumn in 1869. The next autumn is 1889. This one's strongly anticyclonic, above average heights centred over and to the north of the country. Again, probably favouring easterly winds. Remember, as I always say, autumn is a transitional season. So that kind of setup in September is going to be relatively dry and warm. That kind of setup in November, particularly back then in the Victorian era, that kind of setup in November is going to be dry but cold, potentially even very cold back in that sort of era. So overall quite a dry autumn being signalled there, but perhaps transitioning from something warmer to something colder as it went along. The next La Nina autumn off the back of an El Nino, so doing the Nino to Nina transition, is the autumn of 1903. This one looking very, very unsettled with low pressure over the top of the UK. There is a bit of a blocking signal up towards Greenland. I don't think it's a particularly cold autumn, but it does look like it would have been a very, very unsettled autumn indeed. Quite a long gap then to 1924. The next time we go from El Nino to La Nina is during the autumn of 1924. That in the browser is wrong, so let's just change that over. And that's also wrong. It's not 1994, it's 1924. There we go. So the next autumn is 1924. This one, very unsettled autumn again. Look at this. Low pressure in the Atlantic, big time, and throwing up the jet stream like that. So that's a very wet and very unsettled autumn, 1924. Not cold, actually, I think relatively mild, but it is a really, really wet autumn, 1924. Another long gap before we go from Nino to Nina again, and it's to a long gap to 1942. So just going to show you don't guarantee by any means going from El Nino to La Nina all the time. Sometimes you will just go from El Nino to ENSO neutral. And we see that depicted here. So this is the next Nino to Nina autumn, and this one with above average heights, high pressure out to our west, below average heights up to the north, and we bring in a westerly flow like that. It looks like it's a relatively mild and dry autumn in 1942, certainly not particularly exciting. Not much of a gap then to 1954. So the next autumn is 1954, that's going from El Nino to La Nina. This one's an unsettled autumn, very westerly, below average heights to our south, above average heights to the north, and bringing in the westerlies like that. So it's a wet and mild autumn in 1954. No signs of the cold winter that will be around the corner for 1954-1955. Next autumn that's doing the Nino to Nina switch is the autumn of 1959. This one with above average heights to our north-northeast. So high pressure is in to the north and it's bringing in the winds from the east. This is an extension basically of the hot summer of 1959. There's a very dry hot summer in 1959. The autumn of 1959 was very, very dry, and at least until the end of October, really warm too. 1964 is the next El Nino to La Nina autumn. Notice how they've got much more frequent compared to the early part of the 20th century, when we seemingly didn't have all that many El Nino to La Nina shifts. Now they're suddenly getting much more frequent through the middle part of the 20th century. So the next autumn is 1964. This one anticyclonic, above average heights over the UK and much of northern Europe. Low pressure is up here. Jet streams up there too. So this one, again, lots of dry weather and a relatively mild, if not quite warm, autumn. 1964. 1970 looks a little bit similar. This one has above average heights to our south. Below average heights are up to the north. The jet stream going through like that. That's another relatively mild and fairly dryish autumn as well. 1970. 1983, the next autumn, that's going from El Nino to La Nina. So this one with above average heights across much of Western Europe, actually relatively dry, anticyclonic signal, quite a mild autumn as well. Jet stream doing something like that. So relatively dry, mild and quiet in the autumn of 1983. Not a huge amount going on. I think there was a wet September though. Next autumn is 1988. So this one, again, doing the El Nino to La Nina transition. This one with high pressure, again, across much of northern and Western Europe. So a dry, mild, anticyclonic autumn in 1988. Did get a bit more interesting in November 1988, which was a little bit colder. 1995 is our next autumn that's going El Nino to La Nina. So this one, again, has low pressure out to our southwest. It has lots of high pressure covering much of the North Atlantic and into the UK. There's a wet September involved in this. So we have a really hot and dry summer in the summer of 1995. That takes us then through to... it takes us through to a wetter September. Rain came back in September, much needed, much wanted rain in September 1995. And then after that, it goes very dry and warm again in October 1995. November 1995 is a mild month, but also quite wet, and it does have a couple of cold snaps. Overall, quite a warm autumn in 1995, particularly warm in October. 1998 is the next El Nino to La Nina autumn. Now, as I said at the start of the video, these El Ninos have not been tested for the ones that are weak and the El Ninos that are strong. So the El Nino of 94-95 transitioning into that La Nina by the autumn of 1995. That El Nino was very weak. It's a very weak El Nino in 94-95. This El Nino before the autumn of 1998, so the El Nino of 97-98 was a super Nino. It's very, very strong El Nino. So out of the two, you would say that the El Nino that had in 94-95 is more relevant, really, than the El Nino that it had in 97-98, and so therefore the autumn of 1995, when we come to do the autumn forecast with these analogues, we will weight the autumn of 1995 a little bit more strongly than the autumn of 1998. I don't often talk about that side of the forecast, but there are things that go on behind the scenes that we don't mention a great deal in the videos, and they're to do with the way that we weight certain years as more important than other years, if you like. And I never have time to go into that in the actual forecast itself, but this is a pretty good example of it. Out of the two, autumn 1995, autumn 1998, we will weight the autumn of 1995 for this particular package of analogues stronger because it was a weak El Nino going into a relatively weak La Nina, whereas the situation in 1997, 1998 was that it was a very strong El Nino, and it did actually go into quite a strong La Nina as well for the autumn and winter of 98, 99. Anyway, back to the analogues. I went off on a bit of a tangent there, sorry about that. So back to the analogues. This is how the autumn of 1998 is looking. Unsettled autumn, low pressure through the Atlantic into the west of Europe, high pressures out there, and also a bit of northern blocking going on as well. So this one has a very wet October in 1998. As far as November is concerned, there are a couple of cold snaps in there in November 1998. 2007 comes up next. We're back to anticyclonic conditions for the autumn of 2007, which was a relief because the summer, I should say, of 2007 was phenomenally wet. So by the time we got through to this more anticyclonic autumn, it's a bit of a relief to have a break from all of that wet weather. Jet stream is pushed off up there, so relatively mild and a pretty dry autumn. 2007. 2010 is our next autumn, and this one of course has this strong blocking area of high pressure around Greenland, and it has low pressure through the north and through the west of Europe, jet streams like that. So it's setting up the pattern for the December to remember in December 2010. The autumn of 2010 is pretty cold, especially later on as we get into the second half of November. It turns extremely cold in the autumn of 2010. That was going from El Nino to La Nina. And then the last Nino to Nina autumn is 2016. 2016 looks like this in the autumn. Again, anticyclonic with above average heights to our north and northeast, and bringing in the winds from an easterly direction overall during the autumn 2016. Has a very, very hot September in 2016. That was our last really, really hot September. Putting it all together, this is how all of these Septembers combined are looking when we're going from El Nino to La Nina. And what a contrast compared to the El Nino to ENSO neutral autumns. What a contrast. They were anticyclonic, but these autumns, these Nino to Nina autumns, look very unsettled. Look at that big area of low pressure or below average heights covering not just the UK, but much of northern Europe, above average heights up towards Greenland. High pressure tends to be through the Med. Jet streams push southwards. It's a cool and unsettled signal overall with these Septembers. Bear in mind there will be Septembers that deviate. We've got 1959 in there. That was a pretty warm, dry September. And of course, we also have 2016 in there as well. And the autumn of 2016 was another pretty warm and dry autumn too. But overall, these Septembers that are going from El Nino to La Nina are favouring very cool and unsettled conditions. The all Octobers combined for El Nino to La Nina has above average heights out to our west, below average heights to our south. So it's a much more anticyclonic signal, obviously, for these Octobers. High pressure tends to be much more in control, so it's a much drier signal on average for these Octobers. Again, there would be years that are deviating. 1998 is in this analogues package. That's a very wet October. But on average, overall, on average, October favours a drier signal. Probably relatively cool with high pressure out to our west. It's not a particularly warm signal for the Octobers, but a lot drier. All Novembers combined also anticyclonic, and this time the high pressure tends to be over and to the west of the country. Looks a pretty cold signal for Eastern Europe with this trough of low pressure extending through with the jet stream. I would suspect for us they're relatively mild but dry Novembers on average. And finally, putting all of that together, this is how the autumns combined are looking when we're going from El Nino to La Nina. So they're La Nina autumns, but off the back of El Nino earlier in the year. And it's a signal for below average heights to be across the north and the east of Europe on average, with above average heights out in the Atlantic, possibly extending up towards blocking to the north. Could be rather cool with these autumns and relatively dry. Again, bear in mind with that is that the Septembers are very, very strongly favouring unsettled conditions. So the Septembers look very unsettled, quite wet overall on average, whereas the Octobers and Novembers tend to be much more anticyclonic. So you will have those conflicts within the 3 months when you get to that all autumns combined chart. But it's really September that's interesting, because that is such a contrast when you're going from El Nino to La Nina compared to when you're going from El Nino to ENSO. I was very surprised when I saw the difference between the two. It is very striking, and there must be something at work there, because the difference is too great to say that's just random, I think. So there must be something going on there where if you're going into a La Nina, does favour a more unsettled September. Anyway, that is it. So that's the 7th Autumn 2019 Analogues update in the can. And we're going to take another little break then next week, because I think we're doing Solar Sunday next week. So I think we're going to do Solar Sunday next week. If there are any changes to that, then I'll let you know. But as far as I know, we're doing Solar Sunday next week. The 8th Autumn 2019 Analogues update will be the following Sunday. I'm not sure what day that is, but it's 2 weeks today, where we'll do the 8th Autumn 2019 Analogues update. And of course, we're going to release the autumn forecast on the last day of August. 31st of August will be the day that we release the Autumn 2019 forecast from GWV. But at 35 minutes, it's time for me to wrap things up. So this video will be placed on the autumn updates and forecast page. There'll be a written summary that goes with it as well. I'll get that up for you around 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock this evening, something like that. And you'll be able to watch the video on demand and have a read of that written summary. But at nearly 36 minutes, all it remains is for me to say thanks so much for watching. That's all for now. Come back later on for GWV Sunny Roundup. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.